In May 1945, an event occurred in the Austrian Alps that seems absolutely fantastic. Imagine a picture: American soldiers and German officers fighting shoulder to shoulder against a common enemy. French politicians take up rifles and defend their own lives. A famous tennis player becomes a hero of a military operation. This is not a Hollywood movie script, but the real events of the Battle of Itter Castle, the only battle of World War II where former adversaries united for a common goal. Itter Castle has been located in the picturesque Tyrolean Alps for several centuries. It was originally a typical medieval fortress built to control mountain passes. However, time and progress have made their own adjustments to the architecture of the building. In the 1870s, a luxurious mansion appeared on the site of the ancient walls, reflecting the tastes and needs of its era. When the Anschluss took place in March 1938, the annexation of Austria to Germany, the fate of the castle changed dramatically. The Austrian authorities, seeking to establish relations with the new owners, leased the historic building to the Nazi leadership. At first, the castle was used as a resting place for high-ranking party functionaries and SS officers who enjoyed the mountain air and picturesque landscapes. However, the idyll ended in February 1943, when Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler issued an order to convert the castle into a special regime prison. This decision was part of a broader program to create a network of institutions for the detention of high-ranking political prisoners. In March 1943, Itter Castle officially came under the control of the Dachau concentration camp, one of the oldest and most notorious camps of the Nazi system. SS Hauptsturmführer Sebastian Wimmer, an experienced officer who perfectly understood the importance of the facility assigned to him, was appointed commandant of the new prison. Gradually, prisoners began to appear within the walls of Itter Castle, but these were not ordinary political prisoners. The Nazi leadership carefully selected people who could be of particular value as hostages or bargaining chips in future negotiations. Most of the prisoners were prominent French political figures captured during the occupation of France. Among the most famous prisoners was Albert Lebrun, the last president of the Third French Republic, the man who led the country during one of the most dramatic periods of its history. Next to him were former Prime Ministers Edouard Daladier and Paul Reynaud, politicians who tried to resist Nazi aggression and were forced to make the most difficult decisions in the face of impending disaster. The French military elite was represented by generals Maxime Weygand and Maurice Hamelin. Weygand was a legendary figure of the French army, a hero of the First World War. Hamelin also commanded the French troops at the beginning of the Second World War. Jean Barotra, a world-famous tennis player and one of the famous Four Musketeers of French tennis, stood apart from this political and military elite. His presence in the castle was explained not so much by political activity as by symbolic significance. The Nazis understood the propaganda value of keeping the famous athlete in captivity. The French company was complemented by representatives of other nationalities. Among the Italian prisoners were high-ranking military and politicians who fell out of favor after Italy withdrew from the war. The Yugoslavs were represented by the commander of the partisan movement Zvonimir Vukovic, known under the pseudonym Andrei, a man who had led the resistance in the Balkans for a long time and was captured by the Germans during one of the operations. The conditions of detention at Itter Castle were radically different from the horror that was happening in ordinary concentration camps. The Nazi leadership was well aware that these people might be needed in the future, so their physical and moral condition had to remain acceptable for possible negotiations or exchange. Each prisoner received a separate room, furnished with quite comfortable furniture. Moreover, family prisoners were allowed to be in the company of their wives, and some were even allowed to receive visits from close friends. This relative freedom created the illusion of a normal life, even though everyone understood the true nature of their situation. The prisoners had at their disposal an extensive library, collected by the former owners of the castle and supplemented by the Nazi administration. The prisoners could read classical literature, study philosophical works, and even receive some periodicals, though carefully selected and censored by the guards. Physical activity was also not prohibited. The courtyard of the castle turned into a kind of sports ground where prisoners could practice gymnastics, play various games and just stroll in the fresh air. Jean Barotra, of course, organized impromptu tennis matches using homemade rackets and balls. The prisoners' meals were surprisingly high quality. The castle's large dining room served dishes that could be found in good restaurants of the time. The chefs prepared delicious meals using local alpine products and delicacies that were specially delivered for important prisoners. By April 1945, it became obvious that the Third Reich was living out its last days. Soviet troops stormed Berlin, the Anglo-American armies advanced deep into Germany, and Hitler himself took refuge in a bunker, from where he led divisions that no longer existed. In this atmosphere of general chaos and panic, many Nazi functionaries began to look for hiding places to save their own lives. Itter Castle, located in the remote mountains of Austria, seemed to be an ideal refuge for fleeing the retribution of the SS and party activists. They were armed, angry, and in a state of extreme agitation. The presence of these people has dramatically changed the atmosphere in the castle. Previously, the prisoners felt relatively safe, knowing their value as hostages, but now they began to seriously fear for their lives. Escaped Nazis viewed important prisoners more as a burden or even potential witnesses to their crimes. The situation reached a critical point when American troops approached the castle area. Hauptsturmführer Wimmer and his subordinates, not wanting to be captured, hastily left the posts, taking most of the refugees with them. The prisoners were suddenly left virtually unguarded, but it was too early to rejoice. In the vicinity of the castle were the remnants of the 17th Motorized SS Division Getz von Berlichingen, a fanatical unit that continued to resist even after the actual surrender of Germany. These people refused to admit defeat and waged a real war against anyone they considered traitors or enemies. They shot German soldiers who tried to surrender, executed civilians who hung white flags, and terrorized the entire neighborhood. Realizing the threat from the fanatical SS men, the former prisoners of the castle realized that they had to take measures to protect themselves. They searched the premises abandoned by the guards and collected all the remaining weapons, rifles, pistols, grenades and ammunition. Most of these people had no serious military experience, but the instinct of self-preservation forced them to prepare for defense. Zvonimir Vukovic, the only one among the prisoners who had real experience of guerrilla warfare, took command of the improvised defense. Andrei perfectly understood the tactics and psychology of the SS, so his advice was especially valuable. He suggested contacting the nearest Allied units immediately and asking for help. Vukovic volunteered to go in search of American or British troops. Using his scouting skills and knowledge of the area, he quietly left the castle and set off on a dangerous journey through the territory controlled by hostile forces. The first allies the Yugoslav partisan encountered were members of the Austrian resistance movement, who had recently liberated the city of Wurgel. These people were encouraged by the approach of the Allied forces and actively helped them in the fight against the remnants of the Nazi regime. After listening to Vukovic's story about the situation in the castle, the resistance leaders took him to their military commander, and here one of the most amazing meetings of the war took place. The commander of the detachment turned out to be a German Wehrmacht officer, Major Joseph Gangl, who decided to defect to the Allies. Joseph Gangl was a typical representative of the Prussian officer corps, a man for whom the concepts of honor, duty and professionalism stood above political beliefs. He joined the military in 1929, when Germany was still the Weimar Republic, and over a decade and a half he established himself as an outstanding military specialist. The outbreak of World War II found Gangl with the rank of captain of artillery. He participated in the Polish and French campaigns, where he proved himself to be a competent and brave officer. Gangl especially distinguished himself on the Eastern Front, where his battery repeatedly repelled Soviet attacks and supported the German infantry offensive. Gangl was awarded several orders for his military services and quickly rose through the ranks. His military abilities were so obvious that the command sent him to teach at an artillery school, where he trained a new generation of German officers. Having received command of a regiment armed with the latest Nebelwerfer multiple rocket launchers, Gangl was transferred to the Western Front. He participated in the defense of Normandy after the Allied landings, fought in the Falaise Pocket, and took part in the last major German offensive in the Ardennes. However, by the end of the war, Gangl came to the conclusion that further resistance was pointless and would only lead to unnecessary casualties among soldiers and civilians. When his regiment was transferred to Austria and ordered to defend the city of Wurgel at all costs, the major made a decision that radically changed his fate. He refused to follow the orders of his command and forbade subordinates to use force against civilians. Eventually, his unit completely defected to the local resistance movement. After listening to Vukovic's account of the situation at Itter Castle, Major Gangl realized the gravity of the threat. He was well aware of the reputation of the 17th SS Division and understood that these fanatics were quite capable of staging a mass execution of hostages. Therefore, the German officer immediately went to Kufstein, where the advanced units of the American army were already located. The meeting between the German major and the American officers was, to put it mildly, unusual. Gangl appeared to the former enemies not as a prisoner, but as an ally offering his help in rescuing important hostages. The commander of the 23rd Tank Battalion, after listening to his story, immediately contacted the leadership of the 103rd Infantry Division. By this time, Vukovic himself had already arrived in Innsbruck, who duplicated information about the critical situation in the castle. The American command quickly appreciated the importance of the operation. The rescue of such high-ranking French politicians could have serious diplomatic significance in the post-war structure of Europe. The command of the operation was entrusted to First Lieutenant John Lee, an experienced officer who had been fighting since October 1944 and had already proved himself in combat in Germany. After conducting a reconnaissance of the area and examining the castle with binoculars, Lieutenant Lee requested significant forces for the operation: 7 Sherman tanks and several infantry platoons, including a unit of African-American soldiers. German gunners under the command of Major Gangl joined this unusual army. This is how one of the strangest military alliances in history was formed: Americans, African-Americans and Germans united to save French prisoners from their own compatriots. A motley column moved to Itter Castle in early May 1945. At the same time, another group of soldiers from the 103rd Infantry Division was moving towards them from Innsbruck. The plan provided for the connection of 2 detachments at the castle and the organization of reliable defense until the arrival of the main forces. The first clash with the enemy took place on the march. The SS tried to set up a roadblock on the mountain road, but the American tank quickly dispersed them with fire from its 75mm cannon. The enemies disappeared into the forest, but it became clear that they were closely monitoring the movements of the Allies and were preparing for serious resistance. Approaching the castle, Lieutenant Lee decided to divide his forces. Most of the infantry in one tank remained in Vogler, where they were supposed to provide rear cover and communication with the main forces. In the castle itself, there is only 1 platoon of American soldiers, 1 Sherman tank and all German soldiers under the command of Gangl. The meeting of the liberators with former prisoners was quite controversial. On the one hand, French politicians were genuinely pleased with the appearance of Allies and the prospect of liberation. On the other hand, they were somewhat disappointed by the modest size of the rescue team. The important people expected to see an entire division, but instead they were protected by several dozen soldiers, a third of whom had recently been enemies. Albert Lebrun and other high-ranking Frenchmen looked with some bewilderment at the German soldiers in their helmets and uniforms, who now had to protect them. However, there was no time for lengthy explanations. Intelligence reported that SS forces were actively concentrating in the surrounding forests and preparing for an attack. Lieutenant Lee immediately ordered the defense of the castle to be organized using all available resources and people. The Sherman tank was installed at the main gate of the castle so that its cannon could control the approaches to the building. The American infantrymen took up positions on the walls and in the towers, having received good firing sectors. German gunners, familiar with the tactics of their former comrades in arms, positioned themselves at key defense points. Major Gangl, using his extensive combat experience, offered several important tactical solutions. He knew how SS units operated and could anticipate their possible maneuvers. The German officer also took over the coordination of actions between American and German military personnel, overcoming the language barrier. The French prisoners also did not stay away from preparing for the defense. Despite their lack of military experience, most of them understood that their lives depended on the outcome of the upcoming battle. Paul Reynaud, Edouard Daladier and other politicians took up rifles and took up positions next to the professional military. Jean Barotra was particularly active in the preparation. The famous tennis player, who had excellent physical fitness and quick reflexes, proved to be very useful as a liaison and observer. His athletic training allowed him to quickly move around the castle grounds and relay orders between different positions. As the day wore on, the tension grew. Scouts reported the appearance of groups of SS men. It was obvious that the enemy was studying the castle's defenses and preparing for a night attack. The defenders understood that a long and difficult night awaited them. In the evening, the first reconnaissance attacks began. Small SS groups opened fire on the castle, trying to determine the location of firing points and weak points in the defense. The defenders responded with careful shooting, trying not to give away the true positions and save ammunition. The night of May 4 to 5, 1945, became one of the most stressful in the lives of all the defenders of the castle. The SS men methodically shelled the building with automatic weapons, not allowing anyone to relax. From time to time, they launched feint attacks, forcing the defenders to waste their nerves and ammunition. Lieutenant Lee organized a watch system to ensure constant readiness to repel an attack. American and German soldiers took turns at their posts, gradually getting used to working together. The French hostages, who had become active participants in the defense, also kept their watch. Edouard Daladier, the man who once made decisions about the fate of millions, now stood at his post with a rifle in his hands. Paul Reynaud, the former prime minister, studied the device of hand grenades and was preparing to use them against the attackers. By dawn it became clear that the SS were preparing for a decisive assault. Their activity has increased markedly, and the fire has become more intense and accurate. Everyone understood that the crucial moment was approaching. At 4 o'clock in the morning on May 5, 1945, the forces of the 17th SS Division launched a decisive offensive. Using the pre-dawn darkness, the SS crept up to the castle fence unnoticed and made passages through the barbed wire. The first wave of attackers swiftly crossed the open space and rushed towards the castle walls. The defenders opened intense fire from all types of weapons, turning the approaches to the building into a real hell. Machine guns mowed down the attackers, rifle fire hit individual targets, and hand grenades exploded among groups of SS men. However, the enemy was well prepared for such resistance. The SS used smoke grenades to make it difficult for the defenders to aim, and used tactics of short runs and mutual cover. Some of them managed to get close to the castle walls and begin preparations for the assault. The situation changed dramatically when the enemy used heavy weapons. An 88mm anti-tank gun struck from the forest. The first shells hit an American tank standing at the castle gate. The car took a direct hit and exploded, depriving the defenders of their main firepower. The destruction of the tank was the signal for a decisive assault. The SS men, inspired by the success, rushed to the castle walls. Some of them managed to throw hooks with ropes onto the roof of the building and began to climb up. The position of the defenders became critical. They risked being attacked simultaneously from several directions. In the midst of the battle, an event occurred that became a symbol of the entire operation. Lieutenant Lee, realizing the urgency of the situation, decided to climb to the roof of the castle to try to locate the position of the German cannon and adjust the return fire. He was joined by Major Gangel, who knew the characteristics of the 88mm cannon well and could help in its detection. This decision proved fatal for the German officer. When both commanders appeared in the open, an SS sniper, who had taken up a position in the forest, fired an accurate shot. The bullet hit Gangel in the head, killing him instantly. A man who went through the entire war, participated in dozens of battles and managed to survive in the most desperate situations, died in the last days of the war, protecting people he had never seen before. After Gangel's death, the situation for the defenders became even more desperate. The SS, sensing a weakness in the defense, intensified the onslaught. They managed to capture several positions on the castle walls and begin to infiltrate the building. It seemed that the fall of the castle was a matter of the next few minutes. The defenders were catastrophically running out of ammunition. Every cartridge had to be protected, and every shot had to be carefully aimed. American soldiers began collecting ammunition from the dead comrades, while the Germans shared their supplies. French prisoners helped to move boxes with cartridges and grenades. Lieutenant Lee knew that he would not be able to hold out for long. He was thinking of retreating to the interior of the castle, where he could organize the last line of defense. Such tactics would have allowed him to hold out for a while longer, but would eventually have led to the complete encirclement and destruction of the garrison. Communication with the outside world was disrupted. The radio station was damaged by a shell fragment. The defenders did not know if reinforcements were coming to their aid, and if so, when they could expect them. In this critical situation, someone had to take the initiative and try to contact the American forces. It was then that Jean Barotra made his desperate offer. The famous tennis player said he was ready to climb over the castle wall and make his way to the American positions to personally bring reinforcements. This plan was extremely risky. He had to leave the besieged castle unnoticed, go through the SS battle formations and reach the Allied forces. Barotra's plan seemed almost suicidal, but there was no other way out. Lieutenant Lee, after weighing all the circumstances, agreed to this operation. The defenders of the castle had no other choice. Either someone breaks through for help, or everyone dies in the coming hours. Jean Barotra has carefully prepared for his mission. He studied the location of the enemy positions, chose the safest route and waited for the moment when the attention of the SS was distracted by another attack on another part of the castle. He managed to get over the wall unnoticed. The path to the American positions was full of dangers. Barotra had to crawl through the forest, hide from enemy patrols and bypass their firing points. Several times he found himself dangerously close to the SS men, but each time he managed to remain unnoticed. While Barotra made his way to the American troops, the defenders of the castle continued to repel the attacks. The situation was becoming more and more critical. The ammunition was almost gone, and the SS forces were preparing for a new, possibly decisive assault. Every minute of delay could be the last for the besieged garrison. At about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, clouds of dust lit up the horizon as a column of American armored vehicles approached the castle. Jean Barotra has managed to fulfill his almost impossible mission. He not only reached the American troops alive and unharmed, but also managed to convince the command of the critical situation and the need for immediate assistance. A column of Sherman tanks and infantry was rapidly approaching the castle. The commanders of the American units, having received information about the situation, realized the importance of the operation and allocated enough forces to ensure the defeat of the enemy. The reinforcements included both fresh tank units and experienced infantry. The arrival of American reinforcements has dramatically changed the situation on the battlefield. The SS men, who were already preparing for the final assault on the castle, suddenly found themselves in a critical situation. Now they were caught between two fires, the defenders of the castle on one side and the fresh American troops on the other. American tanks immediately opened fire on the SS positions in the forest. 75mm Sherman guns methodically destroyed enemy firing points, suppressed his artillery and destroyed shelters. The infantry, supported by armored vehicles, launched an offensive along the entire front. The SS tried to resist, but their situation was hopeless. Surrounded by superior enemy forces and unable to maneuver, they began a mass surrender. Only a few fanatics tried to break through the encirclement, but most of them were destroyed or captured. The battle for Itter Castle ended in a complete victory for the Allies. The forces of the 17th SS Division were defeated, most of its fighters were captured or destroyed. The threat of mass execution of the French hostages was eliminated, and the castle itself finally came under the control of American troops. The released French politicians expressed their sincere gratitude to all participants in the operation. They especially noted the heroism of American soldiers, the self-sacrifice of German defectors, and the bravery of Jean Barotra, whose desperate mission saved everyone from certain death.